Hello everyone, welcome to my channel once again, where I finally actually played Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, and completed it. I made a speculation video about a year ago. Well, the recording I actually made in January of 2013, so that's over a year ago, but I actually released it. I put it onto YouTube about June last year, so say what you like about that. It took a while because my friend kept forgetting to buy it, and then he had the computer that's powerful enough to actually run it and record, and the recording software, plus the actual money to buy it. So, oh well, it took a while, but we finally got round to it. And last time it was a bit of a ramble, but this time I'm slightly more organised. So we'll get right down to it, I think. Heavy spoiler warning. This will contain heavy spoilers from Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, and Amnesia: The Dark Descent. If you haven't played either of them and wish to do so, or do not wish to wish for me to reveal spoilers about the games, stop this video now and either play it yourself or go and see one of the many amazing walkthroughs on YouTube. You can watch my one on A Machine for Pigs as soon as I actually manage to upload it. Right, so now that those people have gone, the people that didn't want to watch it, let's get right down to it. A quick summary of both the games, right? Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Daniel, you start the game as a man stumbling through the castle who reveals his name is Daniel, and he's forgetting, even as you're stumbling forwards, he's forgetting who he is. He remembers only his name's Daniel, that he lives in Mayfair, and then he blacks out, collapses to the floor. He tells us before he does that. He tells us he has to stop him. And then he wakes up, follows his pink trail back where he came from, all the while collapsing and stumbling about in this castle that he thinks is, well, he doesn't find anyone, looks abandoned. He finds a lantern and he follows the trail back to this note he wrote for himself before apparently having wiped his own memory. He's told that he needs to stop Alexander of Brennenburg, who apparently committed a great crime and that's filled him with rage, and that he should take comfort from the fact that he's chosen to forget. So armed with this knowledge, a lantern, some oil, some tinder boxes, and any other items he finds around the castle as he explores, he sets off to complete his quest. As the game progresses and Daniel moves through the castle, exploring it and discovering, both through flashbacks of his memories and other people's memories, and journal entries he finds from his journal, he starts to remember his past, and the game reveals this as you go on. Daniel was originally an archaeologist for a team that went to on an expedition to Africa. I think it was Algiers or somewhere, and his friend Herbert took him along, and they went to find the tomb of Tin Hanan. And whilst they were there, Daniel was trapped inside, and he managed to find this orb. Now, finding this when he was taken out at long last, he said he doesn't know how he lasted so long. He was suffocating, but they retrieved him after a few hours. He had these broken pieces of orb that he was dragged out with, and he was sent home back to England, and he tried to reassemble them, and he couldn't. And he felt he was being stalked by something, because he'd have these dreams, these nightmares. And after a feverish nightmare one night, he went to his, I forgot what he said, living room, and managed to piece them back together after seeing how to do so in a dream, in one of his dreams. And all the shards, which were changing shape and size, as he said he measured them, they changed shape and size. They fit together perfectly without any need for adhesive. And he visited 3 people. One of them was a geologist to find out about the orb. One of them was is a doctor. And then one of them, I forgot what the other guy was. They all helped Daniel, but they were all killed in brutal ways. And Daniel thought, "Oh no, I'm being followed." He wrote letters asking for help from different people to different people in Herbert's contact book, who at this point had gone missing along with the rest of the expedition. And they found that the they found that the entire expedition had gone missing and that only one person made it back, delirious, after having run through the desert. And the French authorities found no trace of the expedition. Daniel got a reply back from Alexander of Brennenburg saying that he knew, just a simple word of reply, "I know." And he asked him to come to Castle Brennenburg immediately if he wanted help. He did so, and he was told that he was being stalked by a shadow, who was guardian of this orb he'd angered by taking the orb from the tomb. He was told that in order to get rid of it, he had to perform sacrifices, and that there's a ritual he could get through. Now, as the shadow drew closer, Daniel became more desperate, and so he willingly gave in to whatever the Baron asked him to do, whatever Alexander asked him to do. So he kidnapped people, he brought them to the castle, and they were tortured and killed. And then they were harvested for this substance called vitae, which is akin to adrenaline. From that point, from then on, it's revealed that actually Alexander's merely using Daniel for his own ends, that Alexander is actually a being from another dimension, and he wishes to get home by performing a ritual, I suppose, in order to open a portal to get back home. Now, after Daniel kills a girl in cold blood, after she tries to escape, he breaks down and realizes what a monster he's become. So Alexander locks himself inside his inner sanctum and prepares for the ritual, and leaves Daniel to his fate after stealing Daniel's orb. Now Daniel, filled with rage and guilt and remorse, decides to erase his own memories by drinking an amnesia potion, an amnesia tonic, and then that leads to the events at the beginning of the game. Daniel, after he progresses through the castle, finds Agrippa, talks to him, and finds that Alexander broke his orb many years before, even centuries, I think, before, and that that he could reconstruct an orb and breach the inner sanctum and stop Alexander. He could also help Agrippa escape, who had been imprisoned for centuries. Daniel did so and reached the inner sanctum, and then there he is given the choice of either pushing down all the pillars to interrupt the ritual and stop the portal appearing, stop Alexander escaping, and thereby the shadow consumes Alexander for his crimes, but considers Daniel to be redeemed, and so allows him to leave with his life. Daniel confesses that although he can't deny what he's done, he has avenged the fallen, he has redeemed himself, and he has paid for his crimes. Daniel can also, in the inner sanctum, choose to throw Agrippa's head into the portal, which frees Agrippa but costs Daniel and Alexander their lives. But Daniel is then taken into the portal somehow and told everything will be okay by Agrippa. Or Daniel can leave Alexander to go through the portal, which point he is consumed by the shadow, left to, rot in the darkness forever, which is his worst fear. Okay, so that's the Dark Descent. Amnesia Machine for Pigs. Oswald Mandus, a wealthy industrialist in the 1899 on New Year's Eve, turn of the century, 60 years after the Dark Descent, awakens in his bed with no memory of his past. He knows that his children are missing and his children need him. So, exploring his house, he receives strange telephone calls and cryptic messages from this mysterious stranger who tells him that his children are trapped, and that if he helps fix the machine to stop the rising floodwater, his children will be saved, and this mysterious stranger will help him save his children if he does so. Oswald does so, and he fixes the machine as he goes along, activates it, and then realizes too late he's been betrayed. He realizes that actually, all along, the strange voice on the telephone was the machine itself, or the sentience within the machine. He finds out that he was, after having invested all his money poorly, before that, he had his wife died during childbirth, and he promised to her to protect their children. He fell deeply in love with his children, and he said he loved them too much for this world. He would kill, lie, cheat, anything for his children. He loved them dearly. Sometime later, 1898, I believe, Oswald spent plenty of his money trying to invest in machines for his factory, for his business, and the bank refused him credit, and he fears that the bailiffs will come and take his house away from him and leave his children and himself with nothing. So he desperately searches through some paperwork and finds mention of the events from the Dark Descent and the orb and what he describes as his great uncle's work. Now he sets off on an expedition to Mexico, believing that if he can find an orb, it will mean great things for him. When he does get to Mexico and he finds an Aztec temple, he takes the children along, and he's hit by a fever whilst he's there. But he finds an orb, and the orb shatters into half because he's uninitiated with the orb, as Daniel was. He then sees visions of the future of the 20th century of his sons dying at the Somme, and so, knowing what horrors await them, he kills them on the steps, sacrifices them, believing that he can prevent their future if he doesn't let them reach their future. Weak with fever, he returns to England and tries to, seeing how horrible he thinks the world is, he tries to amend this by building this machine to kill off humanity to prevent the horrors of the 20th century. He then goes about, fulfills this, and creates these mutant man-pigs, inspired by Alexander's work. He receives some supplies from Brennenburg Castle. He receives a body of a gatherer, and also some chemicals which he then uses to make Compound X. So it's the Brennenburg Vitae, whatever it was, and his own chemical. He mixes them to make Compound X, which is highly volatile but can also bind cells and theoretically create life. He creates these perfect specimens, so he thinks, something which is better than humanity, and then after having finished the machine, injects some of his blood into the machine to give it sentience, which also takes the shattered half of his soul out, the malevolence. Weak with fever and now free of his dark alter ego's influence, he falls into a coma in his own bed. He tries to sabotage the machine first, then falls into a coma in his own bed and loses his memory, amnesia. He gets the amnesia from there. Back in the present, Oswald makes his way, tries to sabotage his way out onto the streets and wants to get the people to burn down the factory, his factory, and the machine with it, but finds that London's under attack by the pigmen he is accidentally released in following the machine's wishes. Realising that he's responsible for the destruction and the chaos, he heads back underground and sacrifices himself to destroy the machine. Now, that does bring an end to the game. That is the summary of both of them. Now, last year, if you remember my video, I made a few predictions that I'm going to go over them and just see how well I did with them, knowing what I know now and knowing what I knew then. First of all, I mentioned that the machine might have been built by the wealthy, and then the machine was then turned against them by the pigmen, which I believed were perhaps the poor. The poor were fed into the machine because the wealthy didn't view them as any better than pigs that they were originally using, but after running out of pigs they used the poor. But the pigmen, which were then created by accident, then turned against the wealthy and tried to feed them into the machine as a kind of reversal of fate. Or perhaps by pigs themselves. I also expected that perhaps Mandus was an uncaring, selfish individual who was in league with the rich, and that he would, or as a player, I would play as Mandus, who would be hunted by the pigmen for his role in creating them. That the machine would produce pigmen and would also cause the death of those responsible for creating the pigmen. and I thought that perhaps Mandus may have built the machine or needed to destroy the machine, or that he would be fed to it, or that it was running or controlling his life. Now, in actuality, the machine was built by Mandus, but it was Mandus alone rather than the wealthy, and it was to destroy humanity, who he viewed as pigs in his feverish madness. And there was a sort of reversal of fate, because you can see this if you look at in the game itself. There was actually a pig eating at a table. He was eating remains of either a human or something. But it was just mostly symbolic, because several times they will notice that they do refer to pigs and humans together as though we are one and the same thing, or that one really isn't any different from the other. He actually says that through several notes that they will essentially bow to a god that's thrust upon them rather than creating their own one, much like us, that they need guidance, that he sees himself as a saviour, and that in an audio diary, a phonograph, he says that we are the pig, we are all the pig. So mostly this is symbolic rather than too much of a reversal of fate, although it is in a sense. It does symbolise what humanity is in the eyes of that person, of Mandus, and how he views humanity will turn out. And it's better to have these pigmen, the true humanity, he supposes, to prevent the wars and conflicts to come. And actually the machine did produce pigmen, or so I understand, and it did kill those responsible for the world's problems, but it was humanity rather than the wealthy or the poor individually. And it was this idea that by killing humanity he could prevent the problems of the 20th century. But the pigs are subservient to the machine rather than acting of their own orders. I didn't actually expect the machine to be sentient when I wrote it. When I wrote my video, when I made my video, my speculation, I didn't expect the machine to be sentient. I expected it to just be a machine and the pigmen to be the enemy. I didn't know what to expect, but it's clever how the machine itself was the true enemy of the game, and it was the malevolence within the machine that sort of controlled the pigs, which could be again a symbol that humanity is being led by this malevolent elite who wishes to kill off or abuse those under its control and kill off those it doesn't see as pure. And Mandus did actually build and destroy the machine. It's revealed he did build the machine for that purpose, the purposes I've just explained, and that he destroys it at the end, or he deactivates it, and that it does to a degree run his life. He's obsessed by healing the world or preventing the conflicts to come, and to a degree this is running his life. So in a kind of sense he is kind of just it's the cogs within him in a sense. So he is kind of the machine. He does mention several times about industrialization of everything, so like people. He says a clockwork soul, and you get the idea. The efficient human, if you get my drift. Now, I also mentioned the gameplay, things I noted about the gameplay. I mentioned there would be no inventory, and it didn't do a Dead Space system as I wished it would do, where it would have an inventory, just not one that would allow you to pause the game, and one that you'd have to look at whilst at risk of attack, which I think would make it scarier, but it didn't do that. They worked over the AIs. I said they'll make the AIs scarier and more efficient at searching for you, and they kind of did in a way. Hiding was harder due to the fact that there were no real hiding spots like cupboards. They removed the wardrobes and all that from the game, so really you just had to hide behind boxes. So it was kind of a case of crouch and sneak and stay out of the light, more so than in Amnesia, where you could hide it in a cupboard. Although towards the end of the game you didn't tend to hide in cupboards anyway, so it wasn't really that much of a change, but it was a little more difficult to hide, I suppose. And the five key features I mentioned, if you remember back, I said that the five key features that made Amnesia an obstacle for Daniel in Amnesia: The Dark Descent were the shadow, the monsters, the amnesia itself, Daniel's nyctophobia, or his fear of the darkness, and the puzzles. And I predicted that they would be replaced by some other supernatural guardian. The shadow would be replaced by some supernatural guardian or mental fluctuation, so he'd be passing out or something like that, and it would kind of make it more challenging because he had a fever. And I mentioned they had several interlocking storylines. They said they had several interlocking storylines. Some were imaginary, some were real, some in the past, some in the present, etc., etc. And that perhaps this would be his equivalent of the shadow. That it would be his own mind that would be the barrier. That the monsters would be replaced by more monsters, pigmen. The amnesia would be replaced by amnesia, but for a different reason. And the amnesia in the game isn't actually explained, other than that he has a fever and that he's temporarily forgotten who he is. The hemophobia would replace the nyctophobia, so fear of blood would replace the fear of the darkness, or perhaps nothing would replace it. It just wouldn't have a fear, and that the puzzles would just continue on as puzzles. And the actual features, as it turned out, that the machine and the engineer replaced the shadow, that it was his own creation, this kind of overseeing force, this cynicism, pessimism of human nature, and this kind of negativity encapsulated within the symbol of the industrial era, his own sort of conscience in a way, but the evilness, the malevolence of it is what actually replaced the shadow. That was the main enemy, the antagonist. The monsters were replaced by, well, the pigmen. That was evident. The amnesia did remain, obviously, and surprisingly, there was no fear. But surprisingly, the flickering lights near the monsters and your lamp, and the lights in general just flickering whenever there's a monster, did kind of do that. That did kind of work. Because it was sort of it's kind of like a fear, because it's more akin to horror, where you just have flickering lights in dark hallways and that, and it kind of fits, I think, especially in an era where they just got electricity. And to be fair, they didn't miss anything out. They did take that opportunity, and it is kind of a fear because although looking at a monster, not being able to see it, does retain its horror, because you don't know what you're looking at, only that you're scared, and that you know it's having an effect. So it kind of underlines and emphasizes this idea that it's dangerous. It's scarier to not be able to see the monster because the light won't work, because it's flickering. So not only is it a notification, a bit like Daniel's sanity meter, where it gasps and the screen sort of expands outwards and goes back in, and then a monster comes around the corner, and you know at certain points that means a monster's coming. The flickering lights is not only scary, but it does make it more challenging. But he didn't actually have a fear as such. It was just the flickering light. And the puzzles did come back as puzzles, although I think they were a bit more worked down. They were kind of, I think there's one case where it was anything near to the Dark Descent type puzzle, and that was when I had to get the Compound X and use it to burn through a lock. And there were a few other times, but it wasn't quite the same. But nonetheless, they did replace most of the features in the machine for pigs. I also mentioned that I saw in the trailer his I said a daughter, but actually it was his twin boys. I got that wrong, but nonetheless he is a father, and I did get that right, and I did say they'd play a big part, and I was right. I did theorize that they could be an apparition of the machine, and it could be, because it's not really explained why you can see them, because they're revealed to be dead before the events of the game. And I theorized they are hallucinations, I think, but I think they're hallucinations, and it's not explained, but in all likelihood it looks like they're hallucinations. The hallucinations were likely caused by either his fever or the machine itself. And the hallucinations were his twin sons, and I think hallucinations also of doorways. I'm not sure what happened there, but he goes through doors and turns around, the door's gone. I did that once. When I upload my video, there are instances where I'll show you. I'll point it out because I'm going to be doing a commentary of that with my friend, which I did promise. Unfortunately, my the video I did do, I had to do silently without without my friend. He was there, but we didn't have the headset, and we couldn't do it together, so we chose to do just a playthrough instead without the commentary first. Right, now moving on to the imagery. I said before about the imagery of Daniel and the book of Daniel, and then who was friends with Alexander the Great, and Alexander being the antagonist of the Dark Descent. And there's all this imagery there also of the orbs being the power of the sun and the universe, and etc., etc. And it's no different in all the religious imagery in the Dark Descent is no different to the imagery in Machine for Pigs. They have Ozymandias, who is Oswald Mandus. It's symbolic there that Oswald's world is crumbling, like Ozymandias' empire. This idea that all empires will crumble no matter how strong the leader is, and in the same sense, Oswald's world is crumbling. His children are dead. He was racked by fever. He hates the future. He doesn't like it at all, and to him everything's just crumbling around him, which is that it's clearly reflected in his actions. A clear reflection is a name even of Ozymandias. Also, Aztec mythology, where they tore out the hearts of their victims as sacrifice, and then threw their bodies down the side of the temple. And it's not only is it directly referred to in the game, where he goes to an Aztec temple in Mexico and kills his children, but they keep referring to the hearts. They keep saying, the hearts of his children, Enoch and Edwin, power the machine itself. They are what powers the machines, and the machine itself, I think, if you look at it, it's very ambiguous, but the machine is apparently meant to replicate Aztec-style sacrifices on an industrial scale. So it combines the old world of tradition and ancient rituals with modern-day industrialization. And it says, my heart tore and all these things. So it's all symbolic, it's all metaphorical, but it mentions hearts a lot, and it mentions, the life force of people and the seat of the emotions, and it's very symbolic in that sense. But also in the Aztec mythology, they mention that the sun and the moon were once gods who sacrificed themselves to begin civilization and a new world, and also to prevent the apocalypse. They believe that our current world, the present day, is only here because one god, but the god that was meant to sacrifice himself didn't, and then a humble god sacrificed himself, and then the god that was meant to sacrifice himself was ashamed and so sacrificed himself kind of out of guilt, and then they became the sun and the moon. And that's kind of what Mandus wishes to do. He wishes to sacrifice. He says, the pity is they perhaps didn't sacrifice enough people, didn't shed enough blood to prevent the apocalypse. And he wishes to sacrifice people, or humanity, to prevent the wars and the conflicts of the 20th century. So in a sense, he does wish to save the world, to prevent the apocalypse, and to begin civilization like the Aztecs believed. They believed that civilization would only begin when there was a sacrifice, so in order to keep the world going, they believed sacrifice. And in the same way, Mandus wishes to do that, and in a way he kind of does, because he wishes to begin civilization in this new world, and he wishes to prevent the apocalypse, and he kind of does prevent the apocalypse by sacrificing himself and therefore stopping the machine. He allows civilization to continue, and he stops the apocalypse, in which everyone would die. And in this sense, this is what the Aztecs believed, that the god's sacrifice saved the world, in the same way that Mandus' sacrifice saved the world. The pigs themselves, as a symbol, represent humanity, in comparison to my previous assumption that it was the poor or the rich. although I did touch upon the fact that perhaps they may be just hunting Mandus, which is true. They may just be hunting Mandus because I believed he was the person that built the machine. So he did build the machine, I was right there, but the pigs were represent humanity, rather than just a particular type of person in humanity. It is all of humanity. So it's also symbolic because it's humanity hunting humanity, and humanity killing humanity, which is what the machine is saying people will do in the 20th century, just wars and conflict. So it is also symbolic there. So it's it's a reflection of, well, the inner state of the human condition, I guess. I also did mention wanting a link between The Dark Descent and A Machine for Pigs, but I did doubt it would happen, because I said, if you go back and listen, that it's an indirect sequel taking place in an alternate universe, taking place in the same timeline, later period of time, the same alternate universe, something like that. And I said, I wonder what that meant. I wondered, did that mean it would be an alternate universe to the first Amnesia, because there is a game that takes place 500 years after an alternate universe, so they can retcon it. But no, it was the same universe. I thought, oh, this would mean that the Amnesia games take place in an alternate universe, which I thought was explained a lot, because when it originally came out, I did wish for the Amnesia games to be, or the Amnesia Machine for Pigs to fit well within historical continuity. So I didn't want the pigs destroying the entirety of London, because I liked it. I like it when games like Assassin's Creed fit well into history and make sense while still being exciting and entertaining. So in this sense, Oswald Manders saving the world and people not knowing about it, and therefore it's more heroic. But actually it turns out that I thought, okay, well, if it is alternate history, I suppose that works. That ultimately it is, an alternate history, alternate timeline. But it actually seems to fit into our real world timeline. He mentions all the wars, which does seem strange when we have all that advanced technology, pig men running around, the fusion of two different species, all these things which wouldn't even be developed until, well, we still haven't developed that sort of thing now, and then they've got it back then, but the world still continues as it did in the real timeline. It seems strange, but it worked, I think. But like I was saying, the link between The Dark Descent and A Machine for Pigs, I wanted it. I doubt it would happen, but they did actually mention Brennenberg, Vitae, the Orb, the Gatherer. That they got a grunt. It said that, disformed, disfigured, and all that. It describes a Gatherer, and also hinted at Daniel or Alexander, my great uncle. The sort of work he did. He created these, and it could be either. It's quite strange to think that they just put subtle links in, and I didn't believe they'd do anything like that, because usually they don't. So it did surpass some of my expectations in that case, and also surpassed my expectation in the belief that they wouldn't, because like I said, alternate history, I believed it would just be very different. I wouldn't believe it mentioned anything outside the immediate time of the game. So it did surprise me when they mentioned about Hiroshima and, well, not directly, but they did hint towards that sort of thing. They hinted towards the Somme. Well, they mentioned the Somme, but Hiroshima, they hinted towards that. They hinted towards the October Revolution in Russia. They hinted towards some genocides in the 20th century. And that did surprise me, although, then again, they did mention the Napoleonic Wars and the Order of the Black Eagle in the first game, so I guess it's not too much of a surprise, but it did surprise me, I will admit that. And, right, okay, now I've covered all of the, my past video, and I'll move now on to my actual thoughts on the game itself, and my kind of, well, review, really. Right, okay, the actual game itself, the atmosphere was great. It was a dark and foreboding. The atmosphere. The atmosphere was dark and foreboding, and it was what can I say? Yeah, it was grim, but it worked well. It had some daunting settings which were well suited for horror in general, but the story of Amnesia: Mission for Pigs. And the beginning of the game was pretty terrifying. In my playthrough, when I upload it, there's a section where I just keep stopping and hiding, burying my face against the wall in the hope that it won't see me and that I won't be scared if I don't look at it. And I actually turn to my friend at some points and just go, Matt, I think I've seen a monster. And you won't hear me say that, but I'll point it out when I do the commentary, and I'll also you'll see it when I just stop and see a monster and just stop for some time. So yeah, the atmosphere was great. It was dark and foreboding. It was grim. It was with grim and daunting settings, which, like I said, were well suited for the horror and the story of the game. And the beginning of the game was terrifying, and even more so with the flickering lantern. That kind of, not because it would flicker, and you wouldn't be able to see. It was like a strobe effect. So I was worried that not only would it attract the monsters even more, but it would kind of, you can't see it approaching you. It's like a strobe effect, so it just moves to you in like a weeping angel from Doctor Who. It just towards you. It's very creepy, and it did scare me quite effectively. And the levels themselves were beautifully crafted and engaging, and it reflected the time period and the setting, the storyline, and the music and the voice acting really did bring it to life. And I think the story was very impressive. There was the monologue at the end, really, I thought was really, really, really very powerful and profound. And it did raise a good point about human nature and the fact, what I think, I'm not sure, it just did make me feel, I don't know, it really did raise some emotions in me when I realised that actually it's true. This fact that we did kill each other, and it was, well, for everything good that happened, there was a lot of pain and suffering in that era, as there always is, but more so during that time period when technology developed at a greater rate than we've ever seen, and that we really did use a lot of that for murdering and killing and destruction. It was quite horrifying. However, there are some points that do bring it down, like Abop said, or Axel's basket of panic. If you just go and look at the Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs in retrospect, they do it brilliantly, and they can probably describe it better than I can, in a more succinct way than I can. But it raised a point that I'd been thinking of whilst I was writing this. I did think of this, and then he raised it already, so I thought that it did make me think that the levels themselves were very linear, unlike the Dark Descent, in which the levels were hubs and then you went off into sub-levels to find items, to complete puzzles, to move forwards and progress. And unfortunately, in Amnesia: Machine for Pigs, it made me feel more like I was being shepherded along rather than struggling for survival in a hostile environment, which is kind of what I wanted and what I expected from the game. So it's not to say it wasn't a great storyline or that I enjoyed it, it's just to say that it could have been better in that regard. Although, then again, like Abop did say again, he did say it was a different game made for a different experience by different developers. The Chinese Room was famous for doing Dear Esther, and it was kind of a story-driven experience, which is again reflected in Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs. It is a story-driven experience. It is more to do with the story of Oswald Mandis and his kind of him. Although you could say the same for Amnesia: The Dark Descent. It was about Daniel and his background, his story, and his quest for answers and then redemption and revenge. So I suppose that they're both story-driven, but this one is more story-driven than it is gameplay-driven. So I guess you can't necessarily criticise it for that, but that is something I would have liked to see changed. And the lack of ability, though, to explore to the same extent as the Dark Descent did take away from the immersion slightly, because I couldn't get engaged when I couldn't really interact as much as I could. I couldn't pick up items, so there wasn't as much interaction. There was some, which I was grateful for. You could pick up teddy bears and small items like that, but you couldn't interact with a lot of doors were barricaded and you couldn't interact with them, and you couldn't open cupboards. And I know there are a lot of doors barricaded in the Dark Descent, but most of them you can open or interact with. It's just a shame, I think, there, and it just doesn't make it feel. It makes it feel more like the game it is rather than an experience. The Dark Descent, when you first played it, felt more like an experience that you were going through. It really immersed you to that extent. But but the Machine for Pigs, whilst it is very interesting and the story itself immerses me, which is what I loved about the Amnesia series. It's what drew me in, the storyline behind it, the backstory, and the universe of Amnesia. It was the story which drew me in, but the gameplay took away from that because it's more linear and more like a story than an experience. It's not quite the same. The game itself actually felt a little too short, with too much build-up in the first half to something that to me was obvious, because this is a spoiler, although I've revealed a lot anyway. The machine, you for the first half of the game, you work your way down to the core of the machine, deep beneath London, which is quite strange. I'm not sure how they managed to do that. He don't know how he managed to build an entire machine like that with all the materials that probably would have been difficult to get, and in a way that no one noticed. It's very ambiguous how he did that, but nonetheless, and how he fits under London, it's huge if you look at it, but nonetheless, how he spends half the game going under the ground to reach the machine and reactivate it, and you know it's not going to go well. I mean, I know there's build-up, especially right when you're about to activate the machine, and you think, oh no, what's going to happen? Like, are his children okay? And are his children okay? And will they be? How will they fare? How will everything turn out? Fine, but you know the machine is not going to be good. You know the machine is going to be evil, and the machine will cause a lot of problems, and it doesn't do the game justice because you've wasted half the game building up to something that everyone already knew was going to happen. It didn't really work, I don't think. Or at least it's fine as it is. It's just I wish they would have, instead of spending half the game building up to it, it was just, they should have kept it to a minimum, I think. Kept the actual build up to that bit a lot shorter, and then the rest of the game where you're trying to beat the machine made it longer, because there's an abrupt about turn. It just didn't feel right. It felt too abrupt. It felt too disconnected, because it feels like you're just jumping all over the place, because you start off, you go up into the attic, you come back down from the attic apparently somehow, it doesn't explain that, then you go down under the house, you go out into the street, then down again, then keep going down for a long time, then you somehow find your way up, even though it took you ages to get all the way down to the way you did. I'm not even sure how all these things are connected. Then you came back up to the streets of London for a couple of minutes, and then you went all the way back down again, somehow, a different route, back to where you came in a shorter period of time that took you to get down there originally. And then, and that's when the machine was trying to help you, and now, obviously, it's trying to stop you. And it took you a short period of time to get back to the machine to stop it, this time. And then it's jumping all over the place. It just seems like, instead of jumping all over the place as it did, it should have just stayed, it should have spent some time going down, maybe not as deep as it did, then up, spent a bit of time on the surface, then go back down for the finale or something like that, but I'll cover that later. But, so it was it seemed too abrupt and disconnected, the movement from the surface to the ground and back up and down again, and it just seemed too disjointed and jerky. The setting just didn't always work. It just jumped from place to place, and it seemed very disconnected, like I said. And the city and some other places felt too small and lifeless. I mean, London is a big, sprawling place. It's a very huge city. It is the biggest city in Britain, I believe, or at least in England. And if you've been there, it's crowded, it's bustling, it's a metropolis. It is something that if you go there, unless you're American and you live in New York, in which case, never mind, it's because it's probably not quite as busy as that. It's the centre of life in the UK, so, or at least in terms of population, so to make it feel abandoned is quite a feat, but somehow it feels too empty to be, it just doesn't seem like it could have been that empty with everything that's going on. I mean, you got pigmen running everywhere, and there's a bit where you run through the streets of London, and it just feels like you're being shepherded again, but it's not, because whilst I appreciate that horror works best in places like, tight, narrow corridors and alleyways and passages. I mean, even if you're outside and you're in an alleyway, that would be terrifying, and I'd appreciate that, but there weren't enough alleyways. There were just, there were kind of paths to the next section, then you went back underground for a long time, and I just think that doesn't really do it justice, especially when what was advertised were certain parts where it said, oh, you will be going outside. Ooh, that's interesting, but you don't go outside for long. And when you do go outside, you can't explore very far. Everything's blocked off. It feels too narrow to be, I mean, I don't mean that there should never be narrow passageways and alleyways, because that's what would make a great game. It's just that when the entire game takes place in a very narrow, confined space, in a space which should, in real life, be huge, it just feels too small, because even if the streets were opened up a bit more or extended further down, I mean, I know it takes work, but nonetheless, it does take work, but it's there to make the game feel more immersive. And the fact that there were very few people running about, even in the chaotic scene. I mean, right, at the beginning, maybe people are asleep. It is late at night, understandably. But nonetheless, shouldn't there be someone walking around at the beginning? Maybe just in the distance or something. You don't have to have, like, this huge, gathering of people, because that would probably ruin the game a bit. But, if they could make it so that, there was someone walking in the distance or something, and then, during the chase scene, the chaotic scene in London, if it was a bit more extended, and that there were people running about, and more destruction, more fires or something, it just doesn't seem chaotic enough, because there's not much going on. There's the occasional person runs across the screen, but that's sort of scripted and cinematic more than anything else, and it doesn't do it justice. And it's probably just to do with the engine limitations or something, and it's a shame that it was something like that caused it to, didn't do it justice. It's just a shame that it's something like engine limitations, or just the, lack of motivation to put it in, that caused me to feel that way, when it should have been an amazing scene that caused me terror and horror. As it was, it just kind of made me, there wasn't even that many pigmen. I mean, I appreciate that if I was surrounded, that would be too much of a challenge, but they were only there to chase me to the next bit because I wasn't running fast enough. I mean, if they were, a threat patrolling the streets and I had to avoid them, I imagined I'd have to be hiding behind cars while they stole people away and, things like that. But really, the people there were only there to be kidnapped or chased, and it didn't seem very fair that this scene, which should have been something much greater, was so confined. And the ending itself was acceptable, and in some ways it was very clever, and I'll get onto that later. But it was also, very disappointing and very vague. I mean, it doesn't explain anything about, it explains enough, but it doesn't explain the bits I'd like to know, like the machine. It does say, it says about how the machine sacrifices people on an industrial scale, like I said before, but why? If you can just get the pigmen to kill people, why are you just sacrificing people to the machine? Do they have to be alive? And what does the machine do? Apparently it makes pigmen, but there's no real evidence for this, considering that the actual pigmen themselves seem to be crafted by hand. There's even a bit where it shows you where they're made, and it's not in the machine. But nonetheless, it was quite vague, because it doesn't explain to you why what you did, where you sacrificed yourself to the machine. Amanda sacrificed himself to the machine, had his heart tore out. Why that would stop the machine? I mean, why? Surely the machine itself, it was designed to have human sacrifices, to be there to sacrifice human beings. So why would it be that doing what the machine was designed for, sacrificing yourself by having your heart ripped out, why would that stop the machine? Surely that would just not only not stop it, but do exactly what it was there to be designed for. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not going to throw a brick at a tank and expect it to break just because it's... I mean, but in theory, what Mandus was doing was kind of welding more metal plates onto a tank and then expecting it to break, and yet somehow it did, It seems a bit vague as to why that would break the machine out of all things, and how he knew that, and what the machine actually did, and everything like that is just very vague, and I find it a little disappointing because it's just so abrupt and sudden. Right, now let's move on to a comparison of both the games. Now, both of these games, funnily enough, had travel to a new land, so Algeria or Mexico. They found an orb in both the games in the ruins of an ancient civilization, and the disaster following their experience with the orb was covered in the game, which led to their villainous actions, a bout of amnesia, their journey as they recover their memories, and their subsequent guilt, and then their redemption, or attempted redemption, depending how you look at it. And that's present in both games. Now, the characters themselves, Daniel is naive and young, and he seems fearful and almost childlike in his gullibility and his fear of the darkness and his innocence in a way. But he's also determined and selfless, and this becomes evident. It's very evident when he's determined and selfless. He continues on into the darkness. He's very determined there, and he's selfless in terms of he helps Agrippa. If you interact with Agrippa and do make the pushing for him, then he helps Agrippa. He does try to justify his actions, although all people do that, but it suggests that he's not evil. He doesn't wish to hurt people. He only does it because he's desperate. And like I said, he's gullible, so that is kind of one of his characteristics. He's gullible in that he just wishes to survive, and he believes that by doing so, doing what Alexander tells him, he can do so. And his sister Hazel, he reads to her and he looks after her despite his own problems, his own abusive father. He helps her, he reads to her, he takes care of her, so he's quite selfless, caring, and determined. And Mandus, in A Machine for Pigs, he's a father-like figure, not only to his children, he cares for them deeply, and he explains it several times. That's why he's so determined to look for them. You can find that he goes down underground. He says he constantly refers to them as my darlings, and he says he'll kill to protect them, and he says he'll go down to the core of the earth to find them if need be, even when he knows what's waiting for him down there, even though he knows there's pigmen willing to kill him. And he's also father-like to humanity, because he wishes to alleviate the suffering of people. He says, the machine tells him, we wish to save humanity, we've done all this to help people, to stop their suffering and all this. And he says that he says to the professor, what I'm doing, can you justify this by judging how humane it should be? Ask the beggar or the whore or the impoverished what humane is, and it's very true. He's a father-like figure in a way to humanity. He does wish he cares for everyone, and he wants to stop their suffering, especially the poor. That becomes evident. And Daniel's story is one of isolation, redemption, desperation, and guilt and innocence, which is reflected in the slow, creeping soundtracks by Miko Tamiya. And it feels like Daniel's alone in this castle on his quest in the middle of this hostile environment, and where he's nearly powerless against seemingly superior enemies, which only his own abilities can allow him to succeed. He has to rely on himself to succeed, and his own abilities and his own capabilities. And this is reflected by the decrepit, decaying, gloomy, and abandoned castle setting that he finds himself in. It fits well to his story of isolation, and the music fits not only the setting but his story, so it kind of blends well together. And Mandus's story is one of madness, greed, responsibility, and love, and that's reflected in the nostalgic and stringed and occasional piano soundtracks by Jessica Curry, who did the soundtracks for Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, as well as the cityscape and the Victorian level design, which Mandus takes on the responsibility for trying to save humanity. And it's the level design, the storyline, the characterizations for both games are done well for their individual games. The gameplay fits it well. Everything about it does fit it very well, and they're quite different because they have different developers. The composers are different, so the songs, or the music, the soundtracks, the OSTs sound different because they reflect different themes, different characters, but they do it well, and there are some similarities. The core features of the game are still there. The idea of vulnerability and guilt and redemption are all there, but very different characters done in similar ways with a different effect, if you get what I mean. And between the two games, it does seem like the textures have been improved. I mean, especially for the bodies. If you've seen the bodies and Amnesia, The Dark Descent, they look very, well, kind of like mannequin-esque. They're very rigid and not very lifelike, although then again they are dead, so maybe it's meant to reflect their lack of life, which it does well. So that works, I guess, although Alexander is quite a... I don't know what to say about Alexander. I mean, most of them, they work well because they're meant to look dead and sort of decaying or suffering or in pain or something along those lines. So their character design, in terms of their character models, sort of work well. Although there is the obvious issue that Alexander just looks strange in the in-game model. But ignoring that, the bodies in A Machine for Pigs, the character models do look slightly better because you have you have the occasional people you see every once in a while who look a bit more lively, a bit more well animated, if you get my drift. But and the textures I do think work well. They seem to have upped them a little bit, and I like how it's turned out. Although I'm pretty sure there are still some bodies that look quite the Dark Descent-ish. But overall, despite these good points, these improvements, it does lack in scope in terms of the city, because they have beautifully designed, textured, graphically well-endowed level design and game in general, it still lacks in scope. The city still feels small, the areas still feel confined and very linear. So, that's something that they can improve on. And I did actually expect the first 10 minutes of the game. I mean, I didn't know. Originally, I believed when you started the game, you'd just sort of wake up and then you'd go on from there, and there'd be people hunting you almost immediately. Then I found out you had to actually start the machine. I thought it'd be the first 10 minutes of the game just to be like a quick tutorial without any actual enemies trying to kill you. And that it would, I didn't know what I'd expect, but I thought it would be 10 minutes of the game, not half of the game, to start the machine, which is the main antagonist. You're spending half the game helping him, and then you're spending the other half of the game undoing what you've just done. So it seems quite, strange design choice. And I think at most it should have been a quarter of the game. They could have halved the time they'd taken to, help the machine, rather than, spending half the game undoing what, doing what you can to undo later on. It just seems very pointless. But I think perhaps just a quarter of the game at most, where perhaps you fix the section. I believe what it should have been, or I believed what it would be when I first heard about the machine being fixed, is that you'd go down to the basement or the cellar or whatever he had in his house, and you'd fix the section in the basement, perhaps plug in a few things, and which Mandus had sabotaged during his fever. Perhaps just he'd unplugged a few things or broken a few things, so you had to perhaps wander around the house and pick some items and take them down to the basement and then fix it and plug it in, and then when you turn the machine on, it did that kind of thing where the doors close and then it just goes boom, and the engine's starting. You can hear the engines like rumbling to life beneath your feet, and then you look down and the machine blows you back, and you smack against the wall, and then you're unconscious, and then you wake up, you go upstairs, and or you go up from the cellar to the main hall. The big doors where you can't open them, which I tried to. Well, open them. I'll tell you that in the commentary with my gameplay. But you open them, and there's like a bright sort of white light. And then when your eyes clear, London's on fire. There's chaos. There's disruption. There's screams in the distance. Perhaps some gunfire like you did actually hear on the streets of London. So what you saw, but bigger in scope. And then that's when the drums could kick in at that point. Like the Streets of London, the soundtrack, the OST. That could go well there, and then that's the bit where it would work well, like Mandos, oh god, what have I done? Or perhaps he goes upstairs, sees the chaos out the window, then pigmen start trying to break into his house to kill him on the orders of the machine, and he has to run down and disable it. Or like I said, if he gets, and then I thought maybe he could escape. He escapes his house, or leaves his house, whichever, if you believe that opening the door one was better, or seeing the chaos out the window, then having to flee his house, whatever, whichever one. And then he crosses London, avoiding the pigmen, to try and search for his children, believing that they've run off. And crossing London and, visiting some good places that they could throw in, some just London, locations. And then he gets to perhaps a doctor who had treated him when he had his fever, and then the doctor explains the truth, like you built the machine, or something along those lines. Perhaps you mentioned this machine, this dark machine or something, because they have a conversation. I don't know, because there was a part where it actually said, there'd be characters would play a more important role in this game. They kind of didn't, in the same way that there was no interlocking storylines as such, because whilst some did take place in the past, I suppose Edwin and Enoch were dead, so I suppose that everything you heard them say were kind of, and when you saw them it was just them in the past, but I believe it's just a hallucination brought on by the fever in the machine. And there's no characters to interact with in this one, which I thought they'd do well, like in Dead Space with I forgot their name, Zach Hammond and the other one. The two characters that you speak with throughout the game who give you mission directives. Perhaps you could speak with people in that sense, and then they tell you what to do. And that's another thing I found, that it didn't really specifically tell you what to do. It told you, like, get through the level, and then you kind of had to guess, and there were several points where I half completed an objective and then didn't realise I actually had to continue doing it because I didn't actually get any result. And then I wandered around for too long, and then I went back and tried it again, and it worked. Just thought, I've wasted about, a couple of minutes trying to figure out what to do when this was what I was meant to do, but you didn't tell me this is what I was meant to do. So I know the Dark Descent did kind of spoon-feed you, but Machine for Pigs kind of just doesn't. It just goes the other way and goes, no, you will learn on your own. There are a few occasional hints which are very obvious, and some of the puzzles themselves were lacking in sort of, complexity. They weren't subtle, they were very evident, although I think the lock one was clever. It's just not very complex. But going back, just perhaps, if there's a character to talk to, this doctor, like I said, perhaps, who told you the truth, you ranted on about a machine, and based on what you said, I talked to, I don't know, an engineer or something who explained to me how this would work or something like that. I know it sounds convenient, but if they thought about this earlier, there would have been time to develop it and flesh out the storyline. And then you cross back to London, cross back all the way across London, or however far you are away, and then you go to your mansion another way, perhaps underground. I mean, that would be a great time to introduce the London Underground, which would be terrifying to me. And I mean, that's a perfect horror opportunity, and it's in London. And then you could have gone back to your basement, destroyed the machine in your basement, and then discovered that actually most of the machine was underground, and that what you've destroyed was very ineffective, and that and at this point what you've done has come to nothing, and then it leads then to the final confrontation, which you find out you're dead, that your children are dead, and that you need to do whatever to stop the machine. Perhaps you have to tear out their hearts or something, and you could save your children by keeping the hearts intact, or you could, destroy the hearts and kill your children but save humanity, and then, or something along those lines, and that would have been a more emotional final confrontation. But whatever, that it is what it is, and I think that was just a small improvement they could have made. But it is what it is. And also the purpose and the function of the machine, it could have been explained better, as well as the way that Mandus actually defeats it, because the ending is, as a whole, just too vague. It's, you've ripped your heart out and the machine's deactivated. Why? That's not very well explained at all. And, how did Mandus know that was going to work? He could have just killed himself, and then the machine could have destroyed humanity, and he hasn't achieved anything. And it just doesn't seem like it's very fleshed out. I mean, as a character, Mandus is very well fleshed out. He's got his motivations, he's got his reasons, he's got his complexities. And like Daniel, they both have their moments where they out of desperation or out of madness, depending which one, Daniel is desperate and Oswald he has a kind of schizophrenic moment in which his soul splits. They treat everyone differently, and they kind of go evil for a moment, for a period of time, and then Daniel basically starts cursing people. He says, she deserved it, the little bitch, at one point he says. And there is a section where there's a flashback in A Machine for Pigs where Mandus says, do I look like I speak Prussian, sir? Do I look like an inbred hog? And then just rants about who cares what it is, put it down there. And he's quite cruel to people and says, I killed the orphans and all that. By, I smiled at them, then fed them to the pigs and things like that. And they both have this complexity of their characters where they go evil, but they then wish to redeem for their actions. And this is brought out, but the storyline for the antagonists are not so much brought up, and I'm fully aware that in The Dark Descent it's probably good, probably needed and required, because Alexander is mysterious, but the machine, where we're meant to feel that it's a threat, would be a better threat if we knew why it was a threat, and currently it's kind of obsolete and it doesn't feel very threatening unless you're actually up against the machine itself. It feels threatening, but I don't know why. And it could do a better job at explaining it, because then we'd know why. And it just doesn't. It only feels threatening because it's big rather than because it's clearly shown to be dangerous. It's clearly shown to be evil, but it doesn't seem to be powerful, really. I mean, only powerful in the sense it's hard to bring down, but it's not very. It's tough, but it's not strong, if you get my drift. In the same way that you get a very tough, weak person who can't hit hard, but you can take a ton of punches. The machine is kind of like that. It can do a lot. It can't do a lot of damage, really. It's everyone else that does the damage. It's the pigmen that they're the threat, but the machine is just kind of there, And I think it could have been fleshed out a bit more. Definitely, especially some bits that have dragged on too long. Some bits like the descending down to restart the machines dragged out a bit too long. And there's some parts which were too short, like the street scene, the chase scene. I mean, there wasn't enough in there. It was too shallow to be satisfying. It was acceptable, but looking back on it, you think, oh, right. But enough of that. Overall, it is a very good game. It could have been improved in several key ways, but it definitely does do a great job. It's if you're a fan of Amnesia, it's a great game. It does scratch that itch that we've all been waiting for. That game that we've been waiting for to fill that amnesia-shaped hole in our hearts since the end of the last game. But yeah, like I said, it could be improved. It's a good game that could have been made fantastic had it taken some time to perhaps just rectify a few things in it. Aside from that, it's still a game that I really enjoyed, because even though it didn't meet some of my expectations in terms of how it would play out, it did surpass some of my other expectations. So like I said before, I believe I mentioned before about how the ending was very clever, because it mentioned about how his soul split in two and that they had the evil and the good expanders, so that the engineer was the evil part of his soul, his malevolence, his disgust at the human race, and his upon knowing that basically what would happen, he became disgusted. He saw what would happen in the 20th century, and he hated humanity for kind of acting like this and allowing this to happen, and that manifests as the engineer. And it's very clever that the way he defeats him, in theory anyway, because I think that in practice it seems very vague once you think about it and arbitrary and doesn't really make much sense, but it's poetic that the way he defeats him is by joining them back together. They were broken, they were torn apart, and the entire game is about conflict of the human race and the way we will destroy each other, and he solves that issue by joining the fractured parts of his soul back together, by integrating part of himself into the machine, I think. It doesn't, like I said, doesn't explain it, but he does say in a note it's the only way to defeat him, by joining us back together, by closing the circle. And I think, oh, that's very poetic, very clever. And I like the way he does it, and I like the way he redeems himself, he atones for his sins, and it's all clever, but it's just not very practical or logical. I mean, well, in terms of logic is something that you can decide. Perhaps it does make sense logically, because realistically that is how it would work. He does join himself back together, so that kind of stops his malevolence. I got it right third time. But overall, like I said, it's a good game. I would definitely buy it if I were you. It's something you should play at least once. Even if you don't enjoy it, it's an experience, and I would definitely say it's worth buying. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and look out for my gameplay coming soon, and my commentary and gameplay coming soon after that. Thank you very much.